In a cave in Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton nearly 46,000 years old. The man had lived with a withered arm, a missing hand, and blindness in one eye. By the standards of raw survival, he should not have lasted long, yet he did. For years, someone fed him, someone protected him, someone chose to keep him alive. This discovery invites a gentler question. If our ancient ancestors cared for those with physical disabilities, how might they have treated those experiencing mental illness? For a long time, popular imagination painted early humans as ruthlessly practical, a world where only the strong survived, and anyone unable to contribute was left behind. But the archaeological evidence increasingly tells a more compassionate, more nuanced story. It's worth remembering that mental illness isn't a modern invention. It didn't arrive with smartphones or the pressures of contemporary life. Conditions like depression, psychosis, and schizophrenia appear to be deeply woven into the human brain itself, the same brain capable of imagination, connection, and civilization building. Schizophrenia, for instance, has been observed at similar rates, around 1%, across nearly every culture and era studied. That means in a small band of 50 early humans gathered around a fire, statistically, one person may have experienced a reality quite different from those around them. So what became of such individuals? For years, many assumed the worst, that they were abandoned or left to fend for themselves because early communities couldn't spare the resources. It was a tidy theory, but the evidence increasingly suggests otherwise. Consider a woman who lived roughly 100,000 years ago in what is now Morocco. Her remains show signs of a condition likely causing significant cognitive impairment. She would not have survived alone, yet she lived into adulthood, cared for, it seems, over many years. Or look to Atapuerca, Spain, where researchers found the remains of a young person from about 430,000 years ago with craniosynostosis, a condition affecting skull development and often linked to cognitive and neurological differences. This individual, too, lived well beyond when their condition would have become apparent to the group. These are not isolated instances. Across continents and hundreds of thousands of years, a consistent pattern emerges. People who could not have survived independently often did, not because their differences went unnoticed, but because their communities recognized those differences and chose care over abandonment. Perhaps this is one of the most meaningful lessons archaeology offers us, that compassion, patience, and the instinct to protect the vulnerable are not modern virtues layered onto humanity. They may be as old as humanity itself. Perhaps the oldest recorded act of human compassion isn't a poem or a temple. It's a disabled person who lived far longer than survival alone would predict, cared for because their community decided they mattered. But mental illness presented a different kind of challenge than physical disability. A person with an injured body remained recognizable, still fitting familiar social roles, someone whose mind worked differently, hearing voices others couldn't hear, perceiving patterns invisible to everyone else, posed a more bewildering mystery. Remarkably, ancient cultures across the globe arrived at strikingly similar interpretations. They viewed this difference not as brokenness, but as connection to something greater. The voices were considered real messages. The visions were seen as meaningful. What looked like disconnection from ordinary reality was understood as a doorway to another one. Imagine a young man in a Paleolithic community who begins hearing voices, loses sleep, wanders at night, and speaks of things no one else perceives. Today, we might recognize this as schizophrenia. In many ancient societies, he might have been seen as chosen, someone able to move between worlds. He would become the shaman. While the word shaman originates from Siberian Tungusic languages, similar figures appear in cultures worldwide, individuals believed to bridge the ordinary world and the spiritual realm. Anthropologists have long observed that the experiences associated with shamanic figures, altered states, visions, dissociation, closely resemble what modern psychiatry might classify as symptoms of serious mental illness. What we now call symptoms, many cultures once called gifts. A revealing 2015 study published in Schizophrenia Research explored this cultural divide directly. Researchers interviewed people experiencing psychosis-related voice hearing across the United States, India, and Ghana. In Ghana and India, many described these voices as meaningful and sometimes positive, connected to relationships and spirituality, while participants in the U.S. more often experienced their voices as violent, hostile intrusions from strangers. The underlying neurological experience may be similar, but culture shapes interpretation, and interpretation, in turn, shapes lived experience. One of the most compelling insights in modern psychiatry is this: the story a culture tells about madness can shape how that experience actually feels from within. When ancient cultures framed psychological distress as meaningful, even sacred, it may have offered comfort and purpose to those who suffered, rather than leaving them feeling simply broken. That said, it would be a mistake to romanticize the ancient world entirely. Compassion coexisted with fear. Many cultures believed psychosis stemmed from demonic possession, leading to responses centered on containment rather than care. Trepanation, one of humanity's oldest surgical practices, involving drilling holes into the skull, is a striking example. Found on every continent dating back 10,000 years, it was likely intended to release what were believed to be evil spirits. Remarkably, many trepanned skulls show signs of healing around the wound, meaning patients often survived the procedure and were cared for afterward. Someone tended their wounds, kept them warm, and stayed by their side through recovery, even amid such difficult treatment. Ancient Egypt offers some of the earliest written psychiatric records. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, describes symptoms resembling deep despair and mental confusion, recommending treatment rather than abandonment, an approach involving both physical remedies and supportive conversation, with a caregiver present to listen and offer understanding. Ancient Greece introduced a more complex, evolving perspective. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BCE, proposed a groundbreaking idea. Mental illness originated in the brain, not through divine punishment. He described conditions resembling depression, mania, and what we now recognize as postpartum psychosis, advocating treatments like rest, diet, and structure. Yet this rational view didn't dominate Greek thought entirely. Plato suggested that certain forms of divine madness were more valuable than ordinary sanity. The oracle at Delphi, likely influenced by naturally occurring gases, delivered visions and prophecies that powerful leaders traveled great distances to hear, revealing how altered states of consciousness were sometimes deeply revered. Rome contributed a more structured approach, establishing early institutions, valetudinaria, dedicated specifically to healing rather than punishment. At the same time, Roman law introduced guardianship systems for those deemed unable to manage their own affairs, reflecting an early tension between compassionate care and social control. This delicate balance, between viewing mental illness as something to nurture or something to manage, has existed since antiquity, and in many ways continues to shape how we approach mental health today. The compassionate frameworks of earlier civilizations didn't survive intact into the Middle Ages. Increasingly, mental illness came to be understood as possession, with exorcism as the primary response. When that failed, treatments often grew more severe. Historical records from churches and courts reveal deeply troubling practices, including isolation and physical punishment, intended to drive out whatever was believed to be afflicting the person. It remains one of the more difficult chapters in the history of mental health care, and yet, Even during this period, compassion persisted. Many monasteries functioned as early hospitals, offering shelter, food, and structure to those struggling mentally, not because caregivers fully understood these conditions, but because they believed every person deserved dignity and care, regardless of what afflicted their mind. Meanwhile, in 705 CE, the world's first dedicated psychiatric hospital was established in Baghdad. While European medicine largely stagnated, physicians in the Islamic world were advancing what we'd now recognize as clinical psychiatry, classifying mental illnesses, debating their origins, and developing treatments. Al-Razi, a leading physician of the era, argued that mental illness stemmed from the brain rather than the soul, insisting that patients needed medical care, not spiritual intervention, echoing ideas Hippocrates had proposed centuries earlier. Europe's first psychiatric hospital didn't open until 1409 in Valencia, Spain. By 1547, London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, infamously nicknamed Bedlam, had become notorious for treating patients as public spectacle rather than individuals deserving care. Visitors even paid admission to observe them. Meaningful reform eventually emerged through figures like Philippa Pinel, Dorothea Dix, and William Tuke, who challenged these dehumanizing practices and advocated for treating the mentally ill with the same compassion and respect shown to anyone in need. Even today, our progress remains incomplete. The history of mental health treatment isn't a straightforward journey from ignorance to enlightenment. It's an ongoing negotiation between compassion and fear, understanding and misunderstanding, care and control. We continue to grapple with questions about autonomy, treatment, and how to adequately support those experiencing mental illness. Stigma and underfunding remain persistent challenges worldwide. But what the archaeological record consistently reveals is remarkable. Long before written history, before organized religion, before formal civilization, humans already possessed a fundamental instinct to care for those who could not survive alone. In a cave in Iraq, a man with significant physical limitations lived far longer than circumstances alone would allow, not because of what he believed or what his community understood about his condition, but simply because someone decided his life mattered. That impulse, the choice to stay, to care, to see worth in every person regardless of their struggles, may be one of humanity's oldest and most defining traits. The real question isn't whether our ancestors had this capacity for compassion, it's whether we still do.